Hello and welcome to the next episode of this long-term reading project of James Joyce's novel Ulysses. For those of you who happen to be stumbling upon this series for the first time, I recommend watching the previous videos in this series first. You can find all of them in this playlist here. Okay, so today we are looking at the third episode of Ulysses, the episode which is commonly referred to or titled as Proteus. And as usual, let's start with an overview of the structure of my video. So I will start by giving a rough overview and summary of the plot, and I'll talk about some of the narrative devices, and then I will explain, or I will propose a method for understanding the episode or for analyzing the episode, and then I will take a deeper look into the themes and topics of this episode. And in the fourth chapter, I will just bring all these observations together and I will make two different attempts at the interpretation of this episode from two opposing perspectives or viewpoints. Okay, let's start with the first thing, the plot. So the external plot of this episode is rather simple. So Stephen Dedalus walks along the Sandy Cove beach. He observes all the flotsam washed up on the beach. He's watching a dog romping around on the beach. He sees two midwives, a washed up dog carcass, and remembers a visit to his aunt Sarah and his uncle Richie, who live nearby. And then he tears off a piece of Mr. Deasy's letter, and he writes a poem on this piece of paper. And then he picks his nose and he places the result on a rock. And finally, he sees a ship passing very quietly in the distance, and that's it. So this very banal and uneventful plot is contrasted by an all the more vivid inner experience of Stephen. And this brings us also to the main narrative device here. Here we have the so-called stream of consciousness narrative technique in full bloom. Okay, bloom, no pun intended. So we have no recognizable narrator, but instead we feel like we are directly inside the head of Stephen the whole time, and we happen to hear all his thoughts and ideas unfiltered and unedited and in real time, just like a life ticker straight from his brain. And that's what makes it so difficult to understand. And it's difficult to understand on the one hand because not everything that Stephen thinks here are really thoughts in the sense of well phrased or well formed sentences. Instead, it's reported quite realistically, the way as we humans actually think. So these are often just fragments of thoughts, fragments of sentences, single words, sudden jumps because of some association or some memories that are triggered, or some half verbalized feelings which an outsider naturally cannot fully understand, because all this is also strongly influenced and shaped by the very individual memories and feelings and emotions of the thinking person and of this person's biography and character. So if this episode is really something like a life ticker from Stephen's brain, then any attempt to really understand everything is bound to fail from the very beginning. And I think it's therefore perfectly legitimate for readers to remain just at the surface level and to read this episode with the sole aim of gaining just a first and very superficial impression of the mood and of the atmosphere in Stephen's head, without the attempt to or the ambition to understand everything. So that's why I said in my previous video that you shouldn't be frustrated at all if you don't understand 90% of the text, and you don't need to feel bad if you're inclined to skip this episode altogether and continue with the fourth episode, which is much more accessible and easy to understand. Okay, but of course, in this video, we're not doing this thing. We're not skipping this episode. I would like to offer a closer look and to try to bring at least a little bit of order into this chaos of thoughts and language, and to show that it's not just gibberish. There's a lot of hidden structure and a lot of hidden meaning in there. Okay, so this brings us to the second point, the method that I suggest and will try to demonstrate with a few examples in this video, a method how to approach, how to analyze, how to structure this text. So the first step that I am suggesting is to sort through this flood of thoughts a little bit, looking for recurring themes and thoughts and images or memories that are mentioned repetitively, that keep coming back to Stephen's mind. And as in the previous video, I would like to present this in a somewhat didactic manner, so at least as a suggestion, as an offer. If you want to try this approach yourself, you can just stop this video at this point and go through the text with this perspective in mind and make a list of the 5 or 6 or 7 topics that seem to recur throughout this text. And then it would be interesting to compare where there are overlaps and where there are deviations between your lists and of topics and the topics I have identified here. So it would be great if we could compile this, for example, in the comment section. So and then in the third chapter of my video, I will then give an overview of the topics that I have found, and this does not claim to be fully accurate or complete, but it's simply one suggestion from my individual perspective on how to structure this text. And for all topics identified, I will also provide a few references or quotes from the text, so that in order to make this not just an empty claim, but really to substantiate my claims a little bit. And for some, not all of the topics, I will also provide some background information. For example, what are the major traditions of thought or major ideas or historical events or concepts that these topics refer to. And okay, and one could easily end the analysis at this point. And I think this, having reached this point so far, I think this will already give us a good insight into Stephen's inner world, into the world of his thoughts and ideas, and will help us to better understand this character and to get an impression of the topics and questions that he is preoccupied with, and that all the topics that will probably also play a role in the course of this novel. But I think you can also go one step further, and this is what I will do in the fourth section, fourth chapter of my video. I will try to look at these themes to see whether they can be linked together in some meaningful way. So I'll try to look at it from a perspective, is there a certain logic or hierarchy or a sequence in this network of themes? So can we derive one or two overarching themes or a fundamental problem of it, a kind of a life theme that Stephen is mulling over during his walks, and where all the other topics and themes link to or contribute to. And here again, I would like to invite you to pause the video after the third chapter and so after the presentation of the individual themes, and to look for your own approach to how these themes or topics could be meaningfully connected. Okay, let's start with my observations. What are the topics that come up again and again and again? Right? So I have identified a total number of 8 topics. Let's just mention them first one by one and then go into the details. Number 1, philosophy. Number 2, theology. Number 3, cosmogony. Number 4, human existence. Number 5, decay. Number 6, metamorphosis. Number 7, language. And number 8, biography. Okay, so the first topic that really immediately came to my mind is the topic of philosophy, and to be more precise, a very specific philosophical question that is placed at the very beginning of this episode. The question is, what is reality, and how can we recognize it? How can we recognize reality? So it's the first sentence, this so-called ineluctable modality of the visible. it's a strange sentence, and it is in a very condensed form, almost a journey through 1,000 years of philosophical history. So, and the entire first page of the novel deals with this one fundamental question of philosophy: what is reality, and how can we know, and what can we know about it? So, so this is then explained from starting from very early ancient Greek philosophical tradition. So when the texts talk about this il maestro di coloro che sanno, so this is Italian, and here Joyce alludes to Aristotle, because this il maestro di coloro che sanno is exactly verbatim a phrase that is used to describe Aristotle in Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy. So and it translates into the master of those who know, and this is a common idiomatic phrase to identify Aristotle from Dante Alighieri on. So there are other allusions, such as by knocking his sconce against them. This is an allusion to a dispute between the philosophers Berkeley and Johnson, or the mention of the diaphanos, that is or diaphanous, I don't know how to pronounce it. It is the transparency of things. So or a little later, this experiment of Stephen: if I close and open my eyes several times very quickly, is the outside world still there? So I don't want to go into all these references in detail and explaining all of them. That would require a 2 hours video, but rather take a closer look at the fundamental philosophical question that is at the core of this, and try to explain very briefly the philosophical positions to which Joyce refers here in this section. So Aristotle believed that objects in the external world, they do exist in reality. So independently of our consciousness, of our act of perceiving these objects. So although our knowledge of these things is mediated by our senses, that truly resists material reality out there, completely independent of us. So, and this attitude or this way of thinking is called, in the history of philosophy, it's called naive realism. So, and later philosophers have questioned this and have said, okay, yes, maybe, but how do we actually know that? How can we know that? How can we prove that? Our supposed knowledge of things only takes place in our head, in our mind, and it's all mediated by our senses. So that is the only thing that we can say with certainty. So our senses give us the impression that there are things in there, and we form an idea about it in our brain. So, and this was picked up by later philosophers like Berkeley, who said, esse est percipi. So to be is to be perceived. So only things that are perceived in our mind, this means they exist, but we can't tell anything about whether they really exist out there in the world. So there is really only mind and ideas, and we don't know whether there is any other external reality, other substances or objects out there. So that's the position of Berkeley and his and his gang. So and there's a casual counter argument in the text. So, but if you knock your head against something hard, for example, you will notice that objects exist not only in your mind but also in the outside world. But okay, with German philosopher Kant, one could now counter this again, or question this again, and Stephen does so. Yeah, yes. Wait a minute. Even banging your head against something, there is no proof that there is a reality out there. This is again just a perception mediated by your senses, and so then the discussion was moving on, and there were extreme positions, and then there was also an intermediate position between the two. That is, okay, all our perception are mediated by our senses. So, in other words, the visible is only perceptible to us as visible because our sense of sight is the mode that enables us to perceive it. So we cannot directly access the visible or the audible or anything else. It always has to be mediated by one of our senses, which work according to a very specific mode. And so that's the main idea behind this, the ineluctability or the inevitable modality of the visible, the audible, the perceptible, or the recognizable in general. It all depends on the mode that our senses are operating. So, and even the order of space and time, Stephen uses the German words here to describe this: nebeneinander, meaning juxtaposition, and nacheinander, meaning one after the other, so succession of things or events. So we don't even know if this sort of order in spatial or temporal terms even exists, or whether this all just a fiction created by our mind, by the way our senses and our mind operates. It's only the mode in which our senses and our mind convey the world to us. And there are many other passages in the text with sometimes open, sometimes hidden allusions to these questions. And it might be worth going through the text with a rather fine comb from this perspective. And I think we will find out that Stephen cannot find a single, simple, clear answer to this question: what is reality, and how can we recognize it? So maybe we have to talk and think about this throughout the novel a little bit more. Then the second theme, Christian theology. So, well, that certainly comes as no surprise. So all the years spent at Jesuit schools and colleges, they surely have left their mark on Stephen's thinking. And let me just give a few examples and quotes on theological topics that are scattered across this episode. So there's this quote, creatio ex nihilo. So it means creation from nothing. So this is an important Christian doctrine about God as the creator of the universe, who really did not just modify existing things, who had really the creative power to create things out of nothing. And that is mentioned that Eve was not born, but she was created directly. So, which is why she has no belly button. So, this theology has very, very practical implications on the way that people understood the anatomy of the first human beings. So, incidentally, it was actually discussed as an important theological issue in the 16th century, that in Michelangelo's fresco in the Sistine Chapel, that this fresco depicts Adam with a belly button, and there were people, some theologians, who felt offended by it because it's well, no, that's in contradiction to the doctrine that Adam was created out of nothing. He wasn't born from a woman, so he had no navel, no belly button. Okay, and there's the Latin quote from the creation story: et vidit Deus et erant valde bona. So, and God looked at it and it saw that everything was good. So he was satisfied with his creation. It is a good one. And we will see that later on Stephen is actually questioning this, whether the creation is a good one. And then also the Catholic dogma or doctrine of the transubstantiation is mentioned. That is the idea that during the Catholic Mass, the altar bread and the wine, they're actually transformed into the body and the blood of Christ. And then this short interjection, made, not begotten. This is just a reversal of an important Christian doctrine about the nature of Jesus. Because the classic formulation is exactly the other way around, exactly opposite. It goes begotten, not made. So meaning that Jesus is of the same substance as God. Hence also the repeated allusions to the term consubstantiality in the text, which means Jesus being of the same substance, of the same nature as God. Or there's this reference to the two Marys, the women who discover the empty tomb of Jesus on Easter morning. So in retrospect, or in summary, it may be noticeable that most of these allusions from the field of Christian theology, they fall into two distinct groups. One group are allusions to the so-called topic of Christology. So that's the theological tradition of thinking about the nature of Christ being human or divine or both. And and the second group referring to the creation, God as a creator, and whether this creation is a good one or not. And I think this is a good transition to the next topic. In more general terms, several passages of the text, they deal with the origin of our world, or rather the origin of everything, the entire universe or the entire cosmos. And this topic or theme is usually called cosmogony. So stories, explanation, theories about how, by whom, and why everything, the whole cosmos, came into being. So, and there are a few more interesting statements here. First, of course, there are the Christian ones already mentioned, such as creatio ex nihilo, God created everything out of nothing. But a few pages later, and there are also explanations, no, just a few lines later, there are also explanations that go beyond traditional Christian cosmogony. So the most important or interesting one to me is the one about los demiurgos, who makes things by a mallet. So on the one hand, this refers to the figure of Los, described and drawn by William Blake, who is also described or depicted as a blacksmith, but also the epithet demiurgus or demiurge that suggests that Joyce and Blake are referring here to the cosmogony of other religions. And let me give a few explanations of religious history about what a demiurge is. Um, Even in ancient times, there were a number of religions in the Mediterranean area and the Near East. Religions that had one very specific thing in common. They assumed that there were at least two divine figures. One supreme God who represented absolute goodness and all the highest ideals, a perfect divine figure. And however, this supreme God is quite detached, quite separate from the cosmos, from our world. He is not its creator. The actual creator of the world, according to these traditions, was a second subordinate god, more a kind of a craftsman god. And this second one, this is the so-called demiurge. And or in the details, the ideas about this demiurge, they varied greatly between the different Mediterranean ancient religions. Some saw him as a merely imperfect and in some cases even incapable divine being, while other religions even saw him as downright evil. And in any case, this separation into one supreme and good God and an imperfect or incapable or evil God um, that offered an explanation for why our world is also imperfect, why there is also suffering. And we will see several references in the text that Stephen perceives the world as a very imperfect place, which is not easy to reconcile with the omniscient, omnipotent, and benevolent Christian God. So this is the core of the so-called problem of theodicy, not theodicy, but theodicy. Again, no pun intended. Which is a problem in Christian theology that has not really been solved for 2,000 years. For those who would like to delve deeper, here are two major points. Additional points. In the New Testament, in numerous letters in the New Testament, when the writer of the letters warns the Christian communities against heresy, these warnings are directed against the so-called movement of Gnosticism. And these were religious movements that, among other things, had exactly the same conception of God as one distant good God and another incompetent or evil demiurge as the actual creator God. And the second note, one theory in religious studies is that the origin of this Gnostic demiurge doctrine lies in the Zoroastrian religion. That is the religion that was widespread in the Persian region in ancient times, which was decidedly dualistic and that recognized two main gods, the good god Ahura Mazda and his adversary Ahriman. And the ideas about this Ahriman are said to have been the model for the ancient image of the demiurge, and there is also one there are some historians of religions who claim that this idea, this Ahriman figure, was also very influential. It shaped the idea of the devil in the Judeo-Christian tradition, because when the people of Israel was in exile, in the Persian exile, I think 500 or 600 years before Christ, and they came in contact with this dualistic idea, and then this shaped also the way the Jews and the Christians start to think about the very powerful role of the devil, which is quite in contrast to the way the devil is described in the early books of the Bible, who has a more subordinate role. Okay, but let's get back to the text. As you can see, it's easy to fall down some rabbit holes here. Let's move on to the next topic, the human existence. There's a whole series of disillusioning statements are made about human existence. So there are several hints. First, our entire existence is heading towards a great gate. And I think when there's talking about human existence to heading towards a great gate, then one might immediately think of Dante's Divine Comedy and how he describes the gates of hell there. Where is this where there is this phrase written about the gate, abandon all hope, ye who enter here. And this is not the only reference to Dante. There are several references to Dante in this episode. Some are obvious, some are more hidden. And particular attention is paid to the beginning and to the end of human existence. There's this scene with the midwives, the reference to the umbilical cord. There's the reference to Eve, who was created and therefore has no navel. And so that's about the origin of the beginning of human life. And then a drowned body is described, which is only found after several days, and so the decay has started. And so the beginning of human existence fits in with the preceding theme, cosmogony, the origin of everything, and then the end of human life leads quite nicely to the next theme, which is again of a general importance that goes far beyond humanity or human existence, the general topic of decay. So decay is a very big theme in Stephen's thinking, Stephen's world of ideas. On the one hand, he obviously perceives his environment on the beach quite selectively. There's not an idyllic atmosphere of strolling along the beach and looking at the sun and so on. So most of what he perceives is as flotsam are decaying objects, disintegrating objects, decomposing objects. It's talks about rusty boots or crushed seashells. There's rotten wood full of holes. There's a sewer-like stench, or a decomposing carcass of a dog, dilapidated houses, a bedridden uncle, and the color of yellow is everywhere. So we have already seen in his earlier novel, A Portrait of the Artist, that for Joyce, the color yellow is closely associated with decay. Incidentally, many different shades of yellow are described here. So sun and trees and streets and houses and the queen's teeth, even the queen's teeth. So yellow everywhere. A very specific example that also demonstrates nicely how Joyce works with a chain of association and leaps of thought between the themes. So there's this talk about Queen Victoria, and then she's somewhat disrespectfully referred to as the old witch with the yellow teeth. And then Stephen's thought continues, my own teeth, they are miserable. So should I go to the dentist? But is my money sufficient? So from the queen and yellow and teeth, he's moved on to economic questions and just in a fraction of a second. Okay, but back to decay. The whole world is portrayed as suffering from decay, from suffering and injustice. And this is supported by a Latin quote again: "Diebus ac noctibus injurias, patiens ingenuiscit." So day and night, the creation sighs under injustice. The next topic, from decay back to an even more general level. So transformation or metamorphosis is an important theme. Okay, decay is of course also a specific form of metamorphosis or transformation, but also other but metamorphosis is much broader. So also other forms of metamorphosis are described. Things, forms that we perceive as reality, linking back to the philosophical theme, these things confuse us sometimes because they are in constant change. They are constantly transformed. There is metamorphosis going on. And the most famous passage in this episode is probably the one in which Stephen watches a dog romping on the beach. And in all its movements and its postures, the dog seems to constantly change its shape and to take on the form of other animals. So first it reminds Stephen of a hare, then of I think a roebuck, a bear, a wolf, a calf, and then suddenly it starts to dig in the sand as if it wants to bury or to dig up its grandmother, which is again a humorous reference back to the fox in the riddle rhyme of the second episode. And then the waves appear like walruses or sea lions, and the seaweed resembles living creatures hissing up their petticoats, and so everything is in constant change, or giving the illusion of metamorphosis. And using the example of the water corpse being eaten by a minnows, which is a small type of fish that will eat carrion if necessary. So then, a metamorphosis is developed in the form of a partly religious, partly biological chain of transformation, or a sort of a food chain. So God becomes man, so we're still in Christology here, then man becomes fish. We are at the level of the water corpse and biology there, and then fish becomes barnacle goose, and then now we're completely in the realm of biology. And then barnacle goose becomes featherbed mountain, that is back to an object in the service of man. So this transformation, specific one transformation step from fish to barnacle goose. This is another very interesting rabbit hole that I would like to take a look in. So how does a fish become a goose? That on the first superficial level, that doesn't make any sense. There's a bit of historical background might be helpful here. Barnacle goose is a goose species that used to breed exclusively exclusively far away on the Russian Arctic coast. So in medieval times in Europe, people did not know how it reproduced. Nobody had seen these barnacle goose make nest and lay eggs and so on. And there was a somewhat wild, but nevertheless quite common widespread theory that these barnacle goose developed from the so-called goose barnacle, probably because these barnacles, goose barnacles, looked a little bit like the head of these goose. Okay, and so some resourceful monks and theologians then argued, if they develop from these barnacles, then they do not belong to the category of meat, but to the category of fish. And so you can eat them even during Lent, during fasting times. So, and then there were some serious theological debates about this. So some monks were happy to find this loophole. So barnacle goose are fish and we can eat them. So fish becomes barnacle goose. It is therefore a tongue-in-cheek dig at the abstruseness of some theological discussions in the Middle Ages and on this um, ambition to find some loopholes to circumvent some food regulations. And the word barnacle is noteworthy here also for another reason, because Barnacle was the maiden name of James Joyce's wife, Nora Barnacle, so with whom he had his first date on Bloomsday on June 16th, 1904. So this is also a hidden reference or homage to his wife, but also a bit cheeky to refer to her as Goose. I don't know how she reacted to this, whether she punished him or not. Okay, so then we have the theme of biographical elements here, because his Aunt Sally and his Uncle Richie live nearby. This walk along the beach also triggers memories of a previous visit to their home. And so there are also memories of his attendance at Catholic Mass. So he mentions clumsy clerics croaking in Latin and priests raising the host, and etc. And so, yeah, memories of his childhood dreams to become a missionary and to evangelize Europe like Columbanus did before him. And there are also these memories of these sort of artistic epiphanies and the decision to become an artist, an author, the ambition to become a truly famous authors who will still be present in all the libraries across the world, even 1,000 years from now. And there are fragments of French dialogues in his memory. So I think these are memories from his exile in Paris. And again, the memory of this crucial telegram: "Mother is dying, come home." Okay, last topic: language. Language is necessary for understanding and for describing reality. And for Joyce, as for Stephen, language is also the primary material for the artist's work. And any reader will quickly notice that Joyce uses language in a very unconventional way, and not only through the narrative perspective of this stream of consciousness technique, but also by reinventing or reforming words, imitating sounds with words, working with dialects and foreign languages in order to have a broader range of expressive possibilities at his disposal. And he also shows that language can have limitations or can obscure some connections in a way that borders on the ridiculous. Now we have to circle back to the topic of, to give you a good example, we have to circle back or to link to the topic of theology. It gives me also the opportunity to dive back into one specific theological rabbit hole. And you might already have noticed that these topics fascinate me. And I think it's justified in relation to Stephen Dedalus, because also as a former Jesuit student, he constantly thinks about theological questions, or at least he remembers them, even if he no longer believes this stuff personally. So there is a short description in the text about an ancient theologian called Arius, who argued against the idea of the Trinity, and who died in the toilet, which incidentally is actually a legend about this Arius in at least in unofficial church tradition. So this was not made up by Joyce, the story of Arius fighting the idea of Trinity and dying on the toilet. And to describe one of the theological positions that Arius fought against, Joyce invents this monstrous word, con trans magnificent jubententiality. So what does it mean, and what is Joyce getting at here? We had already established when I was talking about the topic of theology, that this question of Christology played an important role. So how exactly does this work? Is Jesus the Son of God? Is he part of God? Is he divine, or is he human? Is he equal? Is he the same age or younger than God? And so how can we mention this being partly divine, partly human, or fully divine and fully human? And how can we then imagine the Trinity? So precisely these two questions, the questions of the so-called Christology, how to understand the human and divine nature of Christ, and the question of the Trinity. So these were the two questions these were the most intensely debated questions in theology in the first century after Christ. And they were also these, the different positions that theologians took, or churches took on these topics. These were also responsible for most of the schisms, the most of the divides in the splitting of churches in church history. So here is a very, very simplified graphic representation of the most important major church councils listed from the left to right, where these two topics were discussed and where they led to divisions of the church. So councils dealing with the questions of the Trinity are shown in blue color, and councils dealing with the questions of Christology are indicated by a red color, and councils with mixed topics are indicated by orange. So here can you see the divisions and subdivisions that in the Christian church, or churches that arose over these questions. And you can see which churches subsequently split off. They left the mainstream as a result of the decisions taken at these councils. And although many of these churches are now extinct or nowadays very small, back then most of these, there were not insignificant small splinter groups, but they were churches that were widespread in terms of numbers or geography. And some of them subsequently became very small, or they disappeared altogether, but this was mostly politics. So it was not because their theological position was irrelevant. It was simply the fact that the reason was that around the year 1000, only the two large churches survived that managed to draw the political power to their sides. So that the Roman Catholic Church in the West and the so-called Eastern Orthodox churches in the East. And so the churches that were able to link to the political powers, their positions are the one that survived and now dominate Christianity. So, and the thoughts that often flash through Stephen's mind: begotten, not made, consubstantiality, or he talks about my consubstantial Father. So these are central concepts, or these were even the decisive battle cries at these councils, that divided opinions at these councils and led to the great divisions of the church. And many of these distinctions, if you look into the details, so what were the different positions on these questions, to us today, they seem to be a type of hair splitting that is hardly comprehensible. And if you look closely, you will also see that there are some very complicated and long terminology used to describe these and to define these theological positions. There is a talk of heterousians and homoousians and aftradokodocetes and defenders of the three chapters and so on. And there were even more complicated and ridiculously sounding labels for these theological positions. And so we can see that this quickly leads to the point where a language, in its attempt to distinguish even more and more precisely, eventually it becomes completely incomprehensible. And it is precisely this kind of theological hair splitting and conceptual monstrosity that James Joyce mimics and mocks at when he creates this fictional theological position called transmagnificentiality. So this is taking elements from different of these disputes and mixing them together. And then, which is with his typically crude humor, then he intertwines this fiction with the historical legend that this noble theological fighter then took his last breath in a toilet. Okay, so this little digression or rabbit hole might have fit just as well under the topic of theology as under the topic of language, but you shouldn't take my own structure too seriously. A little creative chaos is always allowed. Okay, so let's move now on to the fourth chapter of my video, an attempt or two attempts at interpretation. As I said in the beginning, there's no real need to interpret all this further. You can simply stop at this level and rejoice, unintended, you can rejoice that you have found at least a little bit of structure beneath this seemingly chaotic surface of the text. And perhaps you have found other topics as well. You can even find probably cross-cutting themes, such as the color of green, as the color of metamorphosis, of evolution, of creation, as the color of Ireland, but also as the color of the result of Stephen Snow's picking. And then also with these themes or categories in mind, you can either sit back and say, okay, now I understand this strange bird, Stephen, a little bit better, and you can leave it like at that, or you can go through the text again with a fine comb and look for further elements to the topics we have or identified. And I think you will certainly find something, but you can also satisfy with that and say, okay, these topics are so intertwined and interlinked and interwoven that somehow everything is connected to everything else, and it's just a very complex and dense fabric, and let's keep it at this. That's fine too. But you can also try to be a bit more ambitious and to try to get one step further and to try to see whether there perhaps is another level, a kind of an inner logic or sequence in which these themes are linked or connected. So can a kind of a life team emerge, a key topic in which that explains us the way how all these topics are linked together and how Stephen is playing with them. So now let's get back to my didactic attitude. So if you like, you can pause the video now and try your own hand at constructing something yourself, how these topics might be interlinked. Yeah, I can then compare this to my ideas around this topic. I will present two approaches in the following. Two approaches, different approaches that I've tried to develop, not with a claim of correctness or trueness or universal validity, but just as what I consider a plausible attempt, which should not be viewed without a wink. Okay, so my first attempt is an optimistic one. So I believe that the fundamental problem for Stephen lies in the fundamental tension between cosmogony and decay. So the beginning and the end of all, of existence, the existence of the cosmos and of humankind. So where does everything, including humankind, where does everything come from and where is everything going? And of course, the question associated with this, so what's the point of it all? Is the cause a creator God and everything is good or will be good through metamorphosis or for the better and the theological possibility of salvation? Or is there just a demiurge behind it all who is simply messed up or who is downright evil, and that is why everything is coming to a meaningless decay? So problem number one, cosmogony, and that is the highest level of the problem. Stephen is placed passively without his involvement in a creation that is far from being perfect. And from that follows a second problem. Problem number two, philosophy, or the subject-object problem. Even the situation he is in, he cannot come to a reliable conclusion about it because he cannot reliably recognize the reality in which he is placed. All the philosophical systems, Aristotle, Berkeley, Johnson, Kant, they fail. You cannot be sure whether there is a real separation between the subject and the object, between him and the cosmos he is placed in. And then problem number three, theology, or the unity and multiplicity problem. Even if one moves from the material world to the metaphysical or transcendent level, there's no clear answer. Are God and the world and man, are they one or are they separate? And added to this is the fourth problem. Even the question of the nature of reality cannot be answered philosophically in a clean-cut manner. It is pragmatically limited to what can be observed. Everything is in flux, and all forms and manifestations are changing, metamorphosis everywhere. And so if everything flows and transforms and changes, where is stability and security? How can we come to any clear understanding and idea of the nature of reality? And then it gets even worse. All this, the problem of decay. So metamorphosis, it does not always lead to improvement. This may happen locally and temporarily, but the general trend of transformation is towards decay. In the end, all structures decay. Objects and animals and humans and families and even culture and knowledge and works of literature and libraries, they all decay. Everything is doomed. So, and now comes a possible optimistic turning point. So what does Stephen do in response to this situation, or as a solution to this? He becomes active in a creative way. He does not resign. He does not fall into depression. He sits down and he writes a poem. And he also, so that's a mark that he leaves in the world of ideas. And he also leaves something behind on the material level. He demonstratively places his booger on a rock. Okay, the letter is not without a wing and as a creative act, but I think that's real Joycean humor. So what he accomplishes here on a theoretical level is he is creating a clear relationship between subject and object. He is the artist and the subject, and his poem and his Buber are the objects, the creation. And B, it's that he manages the capture of or this depiction of diversity and metamorphosis in a synthesis in one specific fixed poem. And yeah, on number C, letter C, he is transforming an experience into something new. Metamorphosis not as a decay, but as a creation, as the creation of something new. So this does not resolve the initial question in the fields of philosophy, theology, and ontology, but it does shift the question or the problem. On the philosophical level, it's no longer what is real, but the question is, what can I really do? And then he can become active. And on the theological level, it's not no longer where or who or what is the creator, but the question is, how do I become a creator? How do I become creative on a very pragmatic and active level? And on the ontological level, it's no longer what is man or what am I, but what do I create? What do I bring into being? So at the level of the fundamental tension between cosmogony and decay, the question is no longer what kind of world am I placed in and how will I end up in it, but rather what kind of world can I create and what new things can I initiate in this world that I can create. So by this creative act, Stephen has changed his own role and his own fate from being just the object, the helpless object of a demiurge, to being an artist as a subject, as a creator in his own right. So Stephen thus resolves the crisis of knowledge not through better understanding, but through active creation. So that was one possible way of looking at these topics. And admittedly, it was a very optimistic view. And if you read the text with this view in mind, you will also find many supportive clues on a linguistic level that really support this interpretation, and that Stephen seeks refuge in the creative act, and in this way he averts his crisis. The crazy thing, or perhaps the genius thing in relation to the text, is that you can also turn everything upside down. You can look at the text from exactly the opposite direction in a very pessimistic way and come to equally plausible conclusions and find an equal amount of supporting evidence in the text. So I can read it like this. So the poem, it's nothing. It's about a failed love affair. So Stephen is just a failed artist. He writes some erotic fantasies about a woman who has ignored him. He mentioned that he kisses fleshless lips of air, so his vision is insubstantial. It's just a flash in the pan. The rod of ash, it's meant to be, could be a symbol of kings and seers, but it can also be read as a rod made of ashes due to the ambiguity of the English word ash, which can also mean the remains after a fire. And so he tears up Mr. Deasy's letter. So all his art is just based on vandalism, on destructive acts. All his word playing with sounds, this onomatopoeia, so is presented as cosmic sounds, that this is simply silly and meaningless noise. It's playing with sounds without meaning. He has nothing substantial to counter the decay that surrounds him everywhere. His poem is just a worthless scrap of paper, and marking his territory with his boogers, it's just pathetic. So this is not something sublime, but it's vulgar self-deception. So in a figurative sense, Stephen is just pulling garbage out of his head. So could be read as a metaphor that everything was thinking was also worthless nonsense, just garbage. So in the end, Stephen solves nothing. He escapes, he tries to escape from the unbearable reality of decay, but his escape is an escape into some megalomaniacal artistic fantasies. So his so-called acts of creation are a failed compensation for his existential impotence. The booger remains a booger. The poem remains a masturbation fantasy, and Stephen remains a failed intellectual who seeks to cover up his inability to truly cope with life by cover up by this sort of artistic pseudo creations. And the irony is that the more Stephen tries to become a creator, the more he exposes himself as a failed creature, a failed artist. So as an artist, Stephen is a hopeless case who over intellectualizes things instead of living and creating something truly meaningful. Okay, so that's the complete, I've tried to play the devil's advocate now in this approach, a completely opposite interpretation of how the themes in Stephen's minds could be connected and what they could mean in the context of the novel. And yeah, I think it is precisely this complexity and ambiguity, the possibility to look at the text in a meaningful way from different angles, that makes this novel so rich and so dense and so interesting. So we have now managed to cover one of the most difficult, most demanding, and most feared chapters of the novel. And I hope that you're still with me and that this video has convinced you that it's not so bad after all. So there are various ways to not only survive this chapter, but also to gain at least some understanding and food for thought from it. And yeah, I have the impression that this is the kind of chapter that reveals more and more with each additional reading. It's really worth reading it several times, but of course, you don't have to. It's just an invitation. You can also just move on to the fourth episode, which is much more relaxed, and we will talk about that in about a week from now. So thanks for watching this video. If you have enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up and you should subscribe to the channel if you have not yet done so. And yeah, above all, please let me know in the comments what you think about my analysis, where you have some additional thoughts or completely different viewpoints on the matter. I hope to see you next time. So far, till then, have a great reading time. Take care. Bye bye and ciao.